Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Wilder. I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of English. And today I am very happy to introduce Alex Kapitan, our second guest speaker as part of the Language, Writing, and Rhetoric Speaker Series, sponsored by the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies. Alex is the founder of the Radical Copy Editor and does a range of editing related work with individuals, groups, and organizations that want their publications and materials to be sensitive and anti-oppressive with regards to race, class, sexuality, gender, ability, age, body size, religion, nationality, and more. Through this work and through the Radical Copy Editor blog, Alex promotes radical copy editing, which is an approach that, as Alex notes on the website, helps language live up to its most radical potential, serving the ends of access, inclusion, and liberation, rather than maintaining oppression and the status quo. Alex's work on the Radical Copy Editor blog has prompted really rich discussions about language use in some of my courses this semester, and I know the same in Dr. Shelton's course, and I just thank you to Cecilia Shelton for helping us get this event organized and together as well. And we are just so pleased to be able to welcome Alex to speak with us today. So please help me welcome Alex Kapitan of the Radical Copy Editor.
Thank you so much. Oh, it's such a joy and a delight to be with you all this morning. And I'm so happy that the work that I do has proved useful in some of your classes. That just brings me so much happiness and joy. Most of what I do in the world is it's creative as much as it is word nerdery. So being able to put something out that I feel like I have to, you know what I mean? When you're doing something creative, you have this pull and this call to bring into the world something that's within you. And when it's useful to other people or is appreciated by other people, that's really awesome because I feel like I didn't really have a choice in putting out this content. It's more of a call than anything else. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you particularly to Dr. Shelton for inviting me to speak. I'm super delighted to be part of the speaker series. And I know that we're all holding a lot this morning. This is a day. I couldn't even plan this presentation until yesterday because I literally couldn't do anything that was after the election in my calendar until at least the election started to happen. So I'm going to admit that I'm not necessarily on my best game this morning, and I'm sure none of you are either, and that's fine because otherwise I wouldn't expect it any other way. So I just wanted to name that we're holding a lot, and I hope that this hour that we have together can serve as at least an interesting and fun, hopefully diversion from the anxiety or whatever other feelings that you're all holding this morning. I know I am too. So thank you for being here. Thank you for making the time and giving of your time this morning. I wanted to start by just telling you a little bit more about myself. Thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. That was beautiful. As Sarah noted, my work is really all about supporting people in using language in the most liberatory way possible, and using it as a tool to describe and create the world we want to live in, the reality that we seek to make real, because language creates, not just describes, but creates reality. I've always been deeply fascinated with language. Part of what informs my work is the fact that I myself bridge or exist outside of a number of different pretty major divides. I'm not a man or a woman. I'm not gay or straight. I'm not an atheist or a theist. And I'm not Gen X or millennial. I was born in the overlap between those two generations. And this has always made me really curious about how different people perceive and understand the world. And it's also made me sort of a translator of sorts between some of these different extremes in our world. Particularly as a non-binary person, I've had to literally speak and write myself into existence in a world that taught me when I was growing up that I didn't exist, that people like me weren't real or possible. Growing up before the advent of social media, I didn't have any models. I didn't have any access to people who weren't men or women, people who were like me. So I didn't know how to describe myself. I didn't have the language to describe my reality until I really invented it and found it myself, which was a really powerful experience. And as a white person who grew up in an incredibly segregated and racist city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and as someone who's part of a multiracial, multilingual, multi-able slash disabled community, I'm in deep relationship with other people who embody similar sorts of multiplicity. And the core of my work, all of my work, is about solidarity across every possible line of difference. So that's a little bit about what brings me to this work. My Radical Copy Editor project really melds a lot of the different sorts of hats that I wear in the world as a word nerd, super nerd, and an editor, as an organizer and an activist, as an educator, as a community minister, and even as an artist. Radical Copy Editor is about all of these things. And for anybody who is, I know we've got some students joining us as well as professors. For anybody who is currently a student and is sort of like, there's all these different things and that I care about and all these different hats that I wear, and I feel like I have to be different people in different parts of my life. I would just like you to know that I'm a testament to the fact that those things can all come together at some point. You might not know how, you might not know when, but it's really powerful when all the things you care about and all the different people that you have to be in different parts of your life can combine into one really beautiful project. That's what Radical Copy Editor is for me. I worked in publishing for about 15 years, or I have worked in publishing. I don't have a day job in publishing anymore, but I did for a long time. And it started with a really powerful internship that I had when I was an undergrad with South End Press, which was the last collective run, women of color led publishing press in the United States. And they taught me that publishing can be an avenue for social justice, which is what got me into the field. Because I was like, heck yeah, finding typos can help with liberation, sign me up. So that was my route in terms of editing. And what I'd like to do today is to really tell you just a little bit more about my personal approach to language and the frameworks that I use for understanding and using and teaching about language. And then I want to talk a little bit about the power of language to harm or to heal. And I'm going to end my presentation part of this hour together with some specific examples about liberatory language practices and how specific examples of how those play out in practice. And my plan is to keep this presentation part relatively brief so that we have plenty of time for conversation, because I would really love to be able to talk about this kind of stuff with y'all. That's the thing that is most fun and most rich for me. So how's that sound? Pretty good? Also, if I am talking too fast at any point, please tell me, write it in the chat. When I'm nervous or having a lot of feelings about the state of the world, I tend to speak very quickly. And so I would love to know if you would like me to slow down. I am open to that feedback. Okay, I'm going to share my screen right quick. Of course, when we tested this, PowerPoint was right there, and now I have to like sort through the millions of things that are open on my screen. Okay, can you see my little slide? Yay! All right, that's what my website looks like. My little beloved 1984 typewriter. Love it so much. Okay. I joke on my website, I say because I'm an Xennial, I'm part of that little generational cohort that bridges Generation X and millennials. I say I say like the measure of that for me is the fact that I learned to use things like typewriters and card catalogs, but never learned to loathe them, right? So it's fun for me, as opposed to those of you who literally had to write your dissertations on a typewriter, which sounds like hell. All right. So, oh no, advanced slide. Great. Okay, I already talked about that a little bit. Let's talk about some of these frameworks that I just mentioned. Can you see this slide okay? Is my little box in the way? Is it okay? Okay. Looks like it's okay. Great. So the first framework that I use in my work is around the purpose of language rules and standards, like grammar and spelling conventions and stuff like that. And what I ascribe to is this idea that there are two pretty different perspectives and ways to interpret the point of language standards. On the one hand, language standards like grammar and spelling exist to mark some people as right and some people as wrong. And that's the purpose of language rules and standards. You're right if you're educated, as educated as possible, if you're upper class, right? And you're wrong, and if you're uneducated, lower class, etc. That is a pretty different approach to the point of language standards than the one that I use, which is that language standards are about helping us communicate across lines of difference. There are so many people who speak English in so many different parts of this world, thanks largely to do with imperialism, but that's a different story, right? There's so many English language speakers, even within this country, and there's so many different dialects and regional conventions and accents that if we didn't have rules and standards, we wouldn't be able to understand each other. So for me, that's the purpose of standards. It's about comprehension and helping each other communicate effectively across lines of difference. Um, so there's certain language norms that I will fight you till the cows come home about because I believe they aid comprehension, like the serial comma, also known as the Oxford comma. I believe that serial commas help with communication. They decrease confusion about what we're saying when we're reading something in print. And other people disagree, but that's how I feel about it. There are other language norms and standards that I don't care about at all and don't ascribe to because I don't think they aid comprehension in any way. I think that they simply serve to divide those who are right from those who are wrong. For example, the grocery checkout line that has a sign that says 10 items or less versus 10 items or fewer. We know what they mean. Therefore, that norm doesn't make sense in that comment, that context. Saying one is more correct than the other is honestly nothing more than elitism, right? So that's what I ascribe to when I think about the purpose of language news, rules and norms, and it's why I am able to use my nerdy word powers for good. Because sometimes I start talking about my approach to language, and people think, "Oh, Alex just wants to throw out all of the rules." And that's not true. I do want to throw out the rules that serve to do nothing more than uphold the oppressive status quo. But I absolutely love nerdy rules around things like what's the difference between a hyphen and an N dash and an M dash because of things like comprehension and the ways in which we can make language accessible to more people. So it's really important for me to be clear about that because otherwise people are like, well, this doesn't this doesn't make any sense. You're not a copy editor. Okay, so framework number 2, the purpose of sensitive language. Sometimes people call it bias-free language or inclusive language, these sorts of things. There's 2 different approaches to this as well, and so it's important for me to talk about which one I ascribe to. Some people say that the purpose of sensitive language is to avoid offending people. It's about avoiding offense, and that there is one correct way to speak and write. And if you just speak and write in that one best correct way, then you'll be able to communicate perfectly and no one will ever be offended. That's not true. That is a myth. That is absolutely not something that makes sense to me to ascribe to because that's not how language works. Sensitive language isn't about being correct. It's about recognizing that language has power and that it can be a positive tool or a weapon, and that we need to actively work to use language in ways that avoid harm. So that's what I strive to do with language, and that's my invitation to anyone else who is involved in language in any way, which is all of us. The thing that feels really important to me about this framework is that the framework or the idea of avoiding offense, and the fact that avoiding offense is the goal, actually puts the focus on myself. If my goal is to avoid offense, I'm looking out for my own interests, and I'm also putting the blame on somebody else if they feel offended by something that I've said or written, right? Avoiding harm, on the other hand, is about caring for others, not just looking out for myself. And it's about taking responsibility for the impact that my words have on other people, which is super important, right? So that's what that one is. Oh, come back. Okay, great. So the third and final framework that builds on this for me, and this is really at the core of my work, it's my favorite framework, and it's the idea that language is a spectrum. And it's a spectrum from violent to liberatory. There's no such thing as neutral or objective language. That's just not possible, because language is a vessel of culture and norms and values. So there's no way that any of that can be neutral or objective. So hopefully you can read this whole slide despite my little Zoom box in the corner, but I'll just go through what it says. Violent language at one end of the spectrum actively communicates hate, disgust, or intolerance. The next kind of language on this scale is coded language, which consciously or unconsciously communicates prejudice, disdain, or judgment in covert ways. I see some people taking notes. You're very welcome to take notes, but also just know that this is on my website as well. If you go to my blog, you'll find anything that's on any of these slides on my blog as well. Unquestioned language, that middle of the scale, is everyday language that carries subtle cues around who and what is valuable and normal. Minimizing language is next, and it's well-intentioned language that unconsciously maintains norms and supports the status quo. And finally, there's liberatory language, which is the only language worth ascribing to in my book, that affirms all life, communicates compassion, love, and nonviolence, and imbues subjects with agency. So to see some examples of how this plays out, examples of violent language can be seen at the top of this slide. God hates, the F word, and filthy N word. These are actively violent ways of using language. There's no doubt about it. The point of this language is to communicate harm and hate and violence and bigotry. The next example of coded language is traditional family values or disrespectful inner city kids. These There's a lot of really wonderful work out there on the concept of the dog whistle. This is an example of a dog whistle where on the surface this language doesn't necessarily read as negative in any particular way. If you were from a different culture, in fact, or spoke a different language perhaps, and you were just trying to understand what people were talking about in the US or in English, you might not understand what's happening here. But these are ways of subtly communicating or not so subtly communicating, because those of us who are targeted by these sorts of phrases are very clear that when someone says traditional family values, they're talking about anti-LGBTQ policies. And when they say disrespectful inner city kids, it's code for racial minorities and specifically Black and brown youth, right? Unquestioned language examples include, have you met any nice girls? Or clean, pure, white, right? The ways in which norms and values of our culture and our status quo and our dominant cultural norms and values are just baked into language and unquestioned everyday stuff that has a real impact on people who are targeted by oppression, but the people who are using that language generally don't have any sense that they are communicating those norms. So asking someone, have you met any nice girls, implies that it would be wrong if he had met any nice boys. And using words like clean and pure in association with words like white subtly communicate that white is clean and pure and Black is not, right? Is the opposite. Minimizing language examples include, I don't think of you as gay, and you're so articulate, when obviously said to somebody who is presumed to be not articulate. And I'm giving you such a compliment by telling you that you don't ascribe to the negative stereotypes that I associate with people like you, right? And then there's liberatory language. And the examples here are all sexualities are sacred and Black Lives Matter, as statements and concepts and attitudes that really embody the best ways of viewing the world and each other. So that's my take on the spectrum of language. And like I said, this is something you can find on my website as well. Okay, so now that you have a sense of um, why and how I operate with regards to language, I wanted to talk a little bit about building on the spectrum of language, um, the power of language, the real power of language to dehumanize specifically, and the power of language to cause harm. Because this is not, the stakes are high, right? The stakes are incredibly high when we're talking about this sort of stuff. Why strive to use liberatory language? Well, it's because everything else on that spectrum plays into the harm that can be perpetuated through language and through our culture. Dehumanizing language is really powerful, and dehumanization is a specific psychological process in which people are conditioned to perceive members of a target group as undeserving of basic human rights. And dehumanization is rooted in language. It's rooted in the stories that we hear and tell about each other, right? Scholars have documented how the groundwork for mass murder in for political reasons in governments that have sought to murder their own citizens is always laid first by a particular way of using language. First, inflammatory language is used to define and stereotype the target group, and next, that group is demonized and dehumanized through propaganda. This is a very clear trend. So, for example, Hitler and Stalin described their target groups as vermin and poisonous weeds, and Nazi propaganda depicted Jews as lice and rats. During the Rwandan genocide, the ruling Hutu party described Tutsis as cockroaches and snakes. The Khmer Rouge painted the victims of the Cambodian genocide as worms and parasites. So you see this come up again and again and again throughout history in authoritarian regimes. And in the US context, dehumanization is part of our country's history. It's part and parcel of how we have come to be and how we have progressed as a nation, excuse me. Indigenous peoples are described as savages in the Declaration of Independence itself, right? So when we're talking about all men are created equal, that clearly didn't apply to everyone, right? The Obviously, Black folks have been painted as animals over the course of centuries using words like stock, brutes, apes, and worse, and over centuries of enslavement, lynching, and mass incarceration. And obviously, the majority of immigrant groups from sort of racialized and ethnically other contexts throughout our history have been denigrated through language until such time as they manage to assimilate into whiteness for those of them that could, right? This is a very clear pattern throughout our history that's important to be real about. And of course, dehumanization through language has been rampant over the last 4 years of this presidential administration and has been directed at all kinds of people, all kinds of groups, but most notably immigrants, Latinx people, Muslims, and Black folks. So just as an example, just one example of the rhetoric that has been used for the last 4 years by our president and mainstream media. These are words that have been used by him and the press to talk about specifically immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees from Latin American countries. And you can just sort of get the sense that it just starts to overwhelm your system when you hear this language over and over and over again. And dehumanizing language is the perfect example of why sensitive language isn't about being correct or avoiding offense, right? Because this language results in violence, it results in escalating inequality and inequity, and it results in death for the people who are targeted by it. Dehumanizing language conditions people who hear it to look the other way when those who are described in less than human ways suffer, or worse, to directly contribute to those injustices themselves, right? In a groundbreaking study in 1975, there were researchers at Stanford who found that students who overheard experimenters describing fellow students as animals were more likely to give them what they thought were increased levels of electric shock, which was a really groundbreaking study that really documented the real immediate impact of this sort of language. And then you start to think about, what about over the course of your entire lifetime, right? The impact that this kind of language can have. In 2008, researchers found that over a 20-year period, Black defendants convicted of capital crimes in Philadelphia were more likely to receive the death penalty when they were described in ape-like ways in the press, more likely to receive the death penalty. So this is the sort of thing that we all know anecdotally, right? But when you start to see it documented by research, there's no way to avoid the harm that language can do. And of course, not only does dehumanizing language affect attitudes and actions toward people in target groups, it also can be internalized, and it usually is internalized by those of us in those groups, which leads us to believe that we are inferior based on that language, right? So it's both sides of that coin. And obviously, the conservative right is very good at using language as a weapon and working to change the meaning and association that people have with certain words, like immigration, for example. Just the word immigration, bringing to mind a completely different picture in your mind when you hear that word, or terrorism, most notably, right? What do we associate with that word? In 2018, the US Department of Justice instructed US attorneys to use the term illegal alien and not use the term undocumented immigrant, specifically because they understood the power of language, right, to shape perception and shape reality. And of course, most recently, Trump has consistently and very intentionally referred to the coronavirus as the Chinese virus instead, right? This is important and intentional work. Um, and of course, just to bring us down further, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring us up next, I promise. But of course, we all know that anti-immigrant rhetoric has resulted in a direct increase in hate violence against immigrants and people who are perceived as immigrants over the last 4 years, right? Just in the 2 weeks following the 2016 election, reported hate crimes against Latinx people increased by 176%. So language obviously has immense power to do harm. So what can we do about it? Right. Countering dehumanizing language. All right. That's the bad stuff. The good stuff is we have the power to change language and to change reality through the language that we use. And that's why I do the work that I do. Um, Harmful language isn't just about explicitly violent language, right? Just to bring us back to that. Oppressive norms and values are baked into everyday language. So as long as bias and prejudice exist, they will be communicated through language in both conscious and unconscious ways. So countering harmful language means actively working to be aware of violent, coded, unconscious, and minimizing language, avoiding it, and subverting it, right? It means constantly questioning the norms and values that are baked into language and using language that reflects liberatory values. And it means looking to authors, scholars, and activists from communities targeted by oppression and following their lead when it comes to language, right? Not necessarily individual random people, but people who are at the leading edge of this work and of liberatory practice. Again, it's not about avoiding offense or just pure sensitivity, whatever that means. It's about using language as a tool for liberation rather than violence or maintaining the oppressive status quo, because language isn't neutral. We can't just opt out or strive to use it objectively or neutrally. Howard Zinn famously said, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." And language is most definitely a moving train, right? Okay. So I wanted to include this incredible piece by activist and artist Alexandra Bell as an example of countering and questioning oppressive language. Some of you might have seen this. It's been around for a bit. She's an incredible artist, and this piece comes from her Counter Narratives series, which is about taking front page New York Times pieces, editing them, calling attention to the problematic stuff that is just you wouldn't necessarily question, particularly if you are not part of a target group that is hurt by this kind of rhetoric. And then she creates a completely different fabricated liberatory cover story that might have been instead. So this one, of course, is about the murder of Michael Brown. And in the original on the left, this was the actual cover story from the New York Times that you might not be able to read too well, but it contrasted two pieces with the title Two Lives at Crossroads in Ferguson. And one piece is titled A Low Profile Officer with Unsettled Early Days, contrasted with a teenager grappling with promise, or sorry, that's what it should have said, a teenager grappling with problems and promise. And just the being able to visually see what that, how that embodies narratives about, race and police involved brutality and things like this, as opposed to really centering on this young man who was taken unjustly. So I love that. Definitely look her up. She's on Twitter and Insta and all the places and does really amazing work around helping us reframe our perspectives, especially when it comes to media, right? Because that's so important. So let's move on. I'm talking a lot. How am I doing on time? Great, this is good. I wanted to end by talking about 3 liberatory language practices that I use and that I think might be particularly useful in an educational context, particularly. And the first is about embracing the subjectivity of language, right? That language is subjective, meaning is subjective. So it's really important to understand and honor context, right? To explore context specific meanings and norms when it comes to language, and to sort of fight back against this mythology that language is neutral, that there's always a single correct way to use it, that there's always a single correct definition of any particular word or phrase, right? And help students and help each other, help yourself understand that uh, that's not how language works, right? And explore the different ways that meaning is communicated in different contexts. It's really meaningful and powerful to talk about how language and meaning is communicated differently in academia versus news media versus literature versus poetry and music, right? Versus politics. There's, legal language is a whole language in and of itself, right? Corporate culture. There's so many different places in which language is used and differently, and words and phrases and conventions take on different meanings in those different contexts, right? So as just an example of this, let's talk about double negatives for a second, right? Double negatives are subjected to so much ridicule and critique and being accused of being grammatically incorrect, but they are part of speech in lots of different dialects, lots of different cultural contexts. Black speech, Southern speech, rural speech, double negatives are absolutely a part of how we communicate meaning in those contexts. So, what if someone had, and also art, what if someone had told Mick Jagger, you can't sing, I can't get no satisfaction. You have to sing, I can't get any satisfaction. Like, that would have been absurd, right? But the ways in which we ascribe meaning to things like double negatives, grammar rules like double negatives, has everything to do with bias and prejudice and context. The fact that double negatives aren't used in so-called professional writing, right? Like academia and news media, has less to do with comprehension, right? What's the point of this rule? It's not about comprehension so much as oppressive stereotypes about Black people, about rural folks, about Southern folks, and about how those folks are considered unintelligent, and that double negatives are proof of that, right? Now, I'm not saying that you should use double negatives in so-called professional writing, although maybe if you're not from one of those target groups, you could experiment with it and see what happens. If you are from one of those target groups, that is really challenging and tricky, and it's important to understand the impact that that might have and navigate that for yourself in terms of knowing that people may use particular conventions against you if you are stereotyped in this world, right? So that's important. That context is incredibly important. Another example that I like of this particular liberatory language practice is the word queer, right? Queer is probably my favorite word in the entire English language because of how many different meanings it has and the richness of meaning that it embodies. This word means completely different things to completely different people in completely different contexts. And unfortunately, mainstream culture has failed to actually acknowledge this, right? It was only last year that Merriam-Webster, my favorite dictionary, actually updated the definition of the word queer to not just say it's a slur, even though this word has been used in these incredibly beautiful and multifaceted ways for decades, right? So being able to embrace the subjectivity of language means we get to ask questions about what does this word mean in the context in which I'm writing or speaking, right? So those are just two examples of that particular practice. Practice number 2, question where language rules and norms came from and who benefits from them. This is absolutely central to my work, and I didn't even realize that it was until I was being interviewed recently. And it just sort of came out that I was like, I'm self-taught. I did not actually go through any sort of copy editing course or professional degree, certification or something like that. I came into this work because I was curious, because I love language. I'm a nerd. And I really wanted to know, why is this a rule? Where did this rule come from? Particularly when I was learning style guides, because I am now, as a copy editor, well versed in APA, Chicago, and MLA. I wanted to know, how come this style guide says you should do it this way and this other one says you should do it this other way? I wanted to know where these rules came from. And then I wanted to know who benefited from these rules, who is served by these rules. And this is a really incredible practice to use that helps us push back against this idea that there's just a single right way to do anything, particularly when it comes to language, right? Does this norm serve communication across lines of difference, or does it just maintain the status quo? Supporting each other and practicing mindfulness in terms of which norms we follow and which we ditch is really important. And at the end of the day, it's all about caring more about people and their agency, dignity, and well-being than words/rules. That's really at the heart of what I do. So as an example of this language practice, my favorite of this is one that I discovered recently. I was reading a copy editing manual and they started talking about, actually, no, I was looking this up because I had a client whose internal house style guide said that I had to use more than X number rather than over. They were like, okay, we're not going to use over to talk about numerals. So you'd say, Biden has more than 20,000 votes in Wisconsin, not over 20,000 votes in Wisconsin, more than Trump as it is. And I thought, why? This is weird. What is this rule? Is this a rule? Have I been making a mistake for years and not following this rule? And I looked it up and I found out that this has been debunked as a rule. That copy editors across the world have said this doesn't make sense as a rule. And where it came from is that there was, I don't have the details in front of me, but there was an editor of a major newspaper in the United States around 1850, 1890, in there, a long time ago is the point. And he decided to put out a list of all of his pet peeves when it came to language and editing. And on the list was, you shouldn't use over when you're talking about numerals, you should use more than. And then all of his buddies, who were also editors of major newspapers in the United States, were like, oh, we got to do this because so-and-so, it's a pet peeve. And it became a norm and a rule that is meaningless. It doesn't make any sense. But that's where a lot of these sorts of things come from. I think that's really powerful to think about. Another example of this particular language practice is he versus he or she versus they as a singular epicene pronoun. Obviously, this is something that has caused a lot of flurry and hubbub in the world of editing over the last couple of years. Obviously, it's something I have feelings about as a non-binary person, and I won't get into it. I could talk about I could talk about singular they for in another hour, but I'm not gonna subject you to that. Just know that it's a wonderful example of questioning where language rules and norms come from. Because back in the day, hundreds of years ago, they was a single generic pronoun. When you would say something like, "Who left their coat here?" I hope they've come back for it. That sort of usage was standard, and it was only in the last, I think it's 150 years or so, maybe 200, that the powers that be decided, nope, we're going to make they singular, plural, excuse me, and use he as the universal epicene pronoun. And then, of course, in the 60s and 70s, people were like, heck no, he isn't universal. We're going to say he or she. And it led to this horribly awkward, construction of he slash she or his or her and all this stuff, right? And it's only now that we are reclaiming they as a plural pronoun because of the impact, right? Because people matter more than words and people like me exist. So I think that's a really beautiful one. Look into it though, because the history is absolutely fascinating when it comes to that particular quirk of the English language. Finally, oh no, it's okay. We'll still have 15 minutes for questions, I promise. My final favorite language practice is understanding how your own positionality informs your perspective, right? This is super important. So it's really important to be aware of our biases and prejudices and how they show up in our language. People are constantly doing presentations about bias-free language as if it's the language that's biased instead of the people, right? Instead of our culture. So it's really important to be very clear. Sometimes you're using language that's biased without knowing it because it's unconsciously baked into language, right? But sometimes, and lots of times, you're using language that reflects your own biases and prejudices, and that's just as important. In fact, it's more important to be aware of so that you can work to eradicate those biases from your everyday speech and writing. Recognize that dominant perspectives are considered universal, neutral, and objective, while marginal perspectives are considered other. Right? This is hugely important to understand, particularly as a white person. It takes work to unpack the fact that I have been taught that my perspective as a white person is universal, and that when I say we, that is everybody as opposed to just me and my perspective. And finally, locate yourself in your work, in your language. Claim your positionality. An example of this that's really important, particularly when it comes to students and being a student, is that we are taught, I was certainly taught, that I should never say I should never use first person language when I was writing papers, when I was writing dissertations, when I was, putting work out there that other people are going to read in that sort of academic professional context, that it was more objective and more neutral to not use I. And it leads to all sorts of things like passive constructions of the students were given a test or the research was conducted on. No, I conducted the research. I gave the students a test, right? That's clear language. APA style, which is the dominant style with, human subjects research, is really clear on this. They want it to be precise because otherwise it's not clear. But also, if you don't locate yourself, it's also not clear how your perspective is informing what you're saying and your work and all the rest of that. So that's essential to using language in a liberatory way. The other final example I want to give, of something that relates to this language practice is something I just mentioned a minute ago of what's called the editorial we, right? The editorial we is when someone says something like, well, we like to no we oh now I can't even think of an example. I'm working with an author right now who's struggling with this so much because she keeps saying things like, we are taught to be really individualistic. We judge, this is what she said, we judge people who are larger or she said couch potatoes. I'm like, oh my God. So she's saying things like we as if that's the universal experience. But what she's really speaking to is her own experience and dominant cultural experience. And this is something that happens all the time when people use the word we and us and our culture, right? And they're not naming specifically who they're talking about. That draws a circle with language that puts me in that circle along with everyone who shares my perspective, and it puts everybody else for whom that doesn't apply outside of the realm of humanity. Because when you use we that way, you're basically saying all of humanity. That's what the default is. And if it's not true for all of humanity, that then renders people outside that circle. So, Reverend Dr. William Barber III has said that we is the most important word in the social justice vocabulary, and I couldn't agree more.